For 40 years, the water kept its silence. The summer of 2008, however, was relentless, baking the Tennessee soil until it cracked and split open like a wound. Day after day, the sun beat down on the Havenwood Reservoir, and the waterline retreated, surrendering ground it had claimed for a generation. First, it was the skeletal tops of ancient oak trees, their bare branches reaching for a sky they hadn't seen since 1968. Then, slowly, unnervingly, the town itself began to emerge. Rooflines appeared, followed by the stoic facades of brick buildings, their surfaces slick with a dark, greenish algae. It was a ghost town being exhumed by the climate, a modern-day Atlantis rising not from the sea but from the depths of a man-made lake, bringing with it the suffocating smell of mud and decay. The spectacle drew crowds. News helicopters buzzed overhead, capturing surreal images that looked like something from a post-apocalyptic film. On the newly formed shoreline, families gathered, grandparents pointing with trembling fingers at structures their grandchildren had only ever known as submerged hazards on a sonar map. "That was the general store," an old man would say, his voice thick with a nostalgia that was almost painful. "And over there, the spire, that's the First Baptist Church." The name of the town, Havenwood, was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. It was a place that had been sacrificed for progress, drowned to power the cities of the future. But as the water receded further, it became clear the reservoir had been hiding more than just memories and abandoned homes. Of all the structures that broke the surface, the town library commanded the most attention. Built from heavy, locally quarried stone, it stood defiant, its walls remarkably intact despite the immense pressure they had endured for 4 decades. The arched windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at a world that had forgotten them. This building was more than just a repository of books. It had been the heart of the community, the domain of a woman whose story had been warped into a cautionary tale. Elena Caldwell, the town librarian, the woman who, according to local legend, had stubbornly chained herself to a bookshelf, choosing to go down with her town rather than abandon it. Her name was now synonymous with a tragic, almost foolish resistance. The scene shifts to the fall of 1968. The air in Havenwood is thick not with humidity, but with the dust of demolition and the palpable grief of departure. The constant grinding roar of heavy machinery echoes through the valley, a death knell for the town. Families load the last of their possessions onto moving trucks, taking one final look at the homes their ancestors had built. But inside the stone library, there is a defiant quiet. Elena Caldwell, a woman of sharp intelligence and even sharper principles, meticulously organizes her card catalogs, ignoring the evacuation orders plastered on the front door. She is not a madwoman. She is a guardian. She believes the books, the town's records, its very soul, are in her care, and she will not be the one to forsake them. The final days of Havenwood were a tense standoff between the past and the future. Richard Sinclair, the ambitious young chief engineer of the dam project, saw the valley as nothing more than a topographical asset, a perfect basin to hold back the river and generate power. He made speeches about prosperity and the greater good, his voice smooth and reassuring, even as he oversaw the erasure of a community's entire history. To him, and to the authorities, Elena Caldwell was a nuisance, a final, frustrating loose end that needed to be tied up. Her refusal to leave was seen as an act of eccentricity, the last gasp of an outdated world. No one stopped to ask her why she was so determined to stay, what she was truly protecting. Back in 2008, the resurrected ghost town becomes a national sensation. A popular documentary series, Secrets from the Deep, dispatches a production crew and a team of expert divers to Havenwood. Their mission is to explore and film the submerged ruins before the inevitable autumn rains arrive and reclaim the town for the reservoir. The library, with its dramatic backstory of the librarian who vanished, is their primary target. As the divers prepare their gear on the muddy banks, a sense of anticipation hangs in the air. They are not just exploring a building. They are entering a time capsule, a sealed tomb where the truth of Elena Caldwell's final hours might finally be discovered among the silt and shadows. The divers descend into the murky green water and slip through a broken window of the library. Inside, the silence is absolute, a profound quiet that feels ancient and sacred. Their powerful lights cut through the gloom, revealing a world suspended in time. Waterlogged books, their pages swollen into unrecognizable pulp, drift like strange sea creatures. Wooden shelves, warped and bowed, still line the walls. They navigate the main reading room, a ghostly ballroom of floating debris, and make their way toward a small office in the back, the place where Elena would have spent most of her time. It is there, tucked away in a corner and half swallowed by 4 decades of accumulated sediment, that their lights catch the dark, unmistakable outline of something metallic. It is a safe. A heavy, formidable steel box, its surface covered in a thick crust of rust and hardened mud. The combination dial is frozen solid, a silent testament to the years it spent under pressure. This was not a small cash box. It was a substantial piece of equipment, designed to withstand fire and force, meant to protect something of immense value. The lead diver signals to his partner, his movements urgent. This changes everything. The story of the eccentric librarian takes on a new, more serious dimension. People don't leave safes like this behind by accident. The divers attach buoyancy bags, and the slow, arduous process of bringing the heavy secret to the surface begins. As the crane hoists the safe from the water and places it on the cracked earth, it feels like a coffin being raised from its grave. It drips reservoir water, shedding the last of its aquatic shroud, and sits there under the harsh Tennessee sun, an enigma in rusted steel. It is a physical, tangible piece of the past, a direct link to the town's final, desperate moments. For 40 years, the official story was simple: a stubborn woman drowned by her own choice. But this safe suggests a different narrative. For 40 years, the water had done more than just cover a town. It had concealed a truth. It had guarded a crime. And with the turning of a single rusted lock, a 40-year-old secret was about to find its voice. In his Nashville office, 30 floors above the city's relentless hum, Matthew "Matt" Hayes sketched the clean, confident lines of a future skyscraper. His world was one of glass and steel, of precise angles and predictable stress loads, a world meticulously designed to defy gravity and time. The television mounted on the wall murmured in the background, a constant stream of local news he had trained himself to ignore. It was background noise, a meaningless counterpoint to the focused scratch of his pencil on vellum. He was 30 years old, an architect on the rise, and his family's rural, complicated past was something he had successfully walled off, a foundation he preferred not to inspect too closely. He was building the future, and had little time for the ghosts of what came before. Then, a single word cut through the noise: Havenwood. Matt's hand froze mid-stroke. He looked up, his eyes drawn to the screen where an aerial shot was playing, a surreal panorama of skeletal rooftops and muddy streets emerging from the receding waters of a vast reservoir. The images were jarring, like a half-remembered dream breaking into the waking world. He recognized the name instantly, a place spoken of in hushed, almost ashamed tones during his childhood. It was a family legend, a cautionary tale he'd been taught to forget, but seeing it now, raw and exposed under the harsh summer sun, felt less like history and more like a summons, a direct and personal call from a past he thought was buried forever. The news report focused on a particularly stoic stone building, its structure defiant against 4 decades of submersion, the Havenwood Library. The anchor's voice, now crisp and clear in the silent office, recounted the local legend of the librarian who vanished with the town. Crazy Great-Aunt Elena, Matt whispered to himself, the old, bitter family label tasting like ash in his mouth. The story he'd always heard was of a woman unhinged by grief, who chained herself to a bookshelf in a final, futile act of protest. It was a narrative that had cast a long, embarrassing shadow over his family, a stain of eccentricity he had worked hard to distance himself from, with his own life of logic and order. He watched, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his drafting table, as a team of divers from a documentary series prepared their equipment on the muddy shore. A morbid curiosity, mingled with a deep, unsettling dread, took hold of him. He felt a powerful urge to turn away, to return to the comforting certainty of his blueprints, to shut out the ghosts the receding water was stirring up. Yet he was completely captivated, anchored to the unfolding scene. It felt as if those divers were not just exploring a forgotten building, but were about to break into a sealed chamber of his own identity, a room he never knew existed but instinctively felt was his to protect. The broadcast switched to an underwater camera feed. The divers, powerful lights, sliced through the green, debris-filled gloom of the library's interior. Matt leaned closer, his breath fogging the corner of his computer monitor. The scene was ghostly, a silent, slow-motion ballet of decay. Then, the divers' movements became more agitated. Their lights converged on a dark, solid shape in a back office, half buried in silt. It was a safe. A heavy, industrial steel safe. The sight of it sent a shockwave through Matt. This was not the prop of a madwoman's tragic opera. Safes were for secrets, for things of value, for truths that needed protecting. This single object shattered the family myth, replacing it with a far more complex and dangerous question. His phone buzzed violently on the desk, startling him. It was his mother, her name flashing on the screen with an almost psychic sense of timing. He answered, and her voice came through, thin and frayed with an anxiety he knew all too well. "Matt, are you watching this? About Havenwood? They shouldn't be disturbing things. Some things are better left buried." Her words were a plea, a desperate attempt to reinforce the walls he had just felt crumble. She wanted the story to remain a tragedy, a simple, sad tale of a disturbed ancestor. But the image of the safe was seared into Matt's mind, a symbol of something far more deliberate and far more sinister than a woman's grief. He ended the call with a non-committal murmur, leaving his mother's anxieties hanging in the air between them. The inherited shame she carried felt heavier than ever, but now it felt misplaced. He looked around his pristine office, a monument to his success and his escape from that very past. The awards for his designs, the sleek furniture, the panoramic view of the city, it all felt suddenly superficial. He had built his life on a carefully constructed narrative of progress, moving forward without ever looking back. But how strong could a structure be if its foundation was a lie, a story told to cover up an uncomfortable truth? He realized he didn't know the first thing about the real Elena Caldwell. The news segment wrapped up, the anchor posing a dramatic made-for-television question to the audience. What secrets was the librarian of Havenwood so desperate to protect? For the viewers at home, it was a tantalizing hook for a primetime special. For Matt, it was a splinter lodging itself deep in his soul. It was no longer a story about his family. It was a mystery that was now his to solve. The shame he once felt was morphing into something else entirely. A sense of duty, a burning need to reclaim the narrative from the realm of folklore and anchor it in fact. The safe was a locked box, and he felt as if Elena herself had just handed him the key. Driven by a new, urgent impulse, he opened his laptop and searched through digitized family archives, scrolling past smiling photos from holidays and birthdays until he found what he was looking for. It was a faded, black-and-white photograph from 1967. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and an unyielding set to her jaw stood proudly on the steps of the Havenwood Library. She was not the wild-eyed eccentric from the family legends. She looked grounded, fierce, and principled. She looked like a guardian. In that moment, Matt understood that her final act wasn't one of surrender. It was one of defiance. She wasn't just protecting books. She was protecting a truth so vital she was willing to die for it. A decision crystallized in his mind, sharp and clear as the lines on his blueprints. He was an architect. His entire career was about understanding what lies beneath the surface, about ensuring the integrity of a structure from its deepest footings to its highest point. This was no different. He had to excavate his own history, to understand the true design of his family's past. This was no longer about shame or curiosity. It was about justice for the woman in the photograph, the woman whose legacy had been deliberately distorted. He had to know what was in that safe, not just for her, but for himself. The truth was the foundation, and his had been cracked for far too long. With a final, decisive click, he closed the architecture software on his screen. The gleaming skyscraper, a symbol of his future, vanished, replaced by the determined face of his great-aunt. He grabbed his keys from the bowl on his desk, the familiar weight in his hand now feeling like a new responsibility. His next project wouldn't be built of steel and glass. It would be built from mud, water, and 40 years of silence. He was leaving his orderly life behind and driving toward the ghost town of Havenwood. He was going to uncover the truth, because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that what the water concealed was far more than a town. It was a crime. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. But this was only the beginning of what was to come. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you think you could handle the weight of uncovering a dark family's secret? The journey to find the truth is often harder than living with the lie. If you're ready to see where this investigation leads, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single clue. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know how far Elena's story has traveled. Now, let's get back to what happened in that town. To understand the secret buried beneath the Havenwood Reservoir, you must first understand the town that was sacrificed. In the spring of 1968, Havenwood, Tennessee, was a place held together by tradition and geography. Tucked into a fertile valley carved by the Ocoee River, it was a community of just over 800 souls, where family names were as old as the oak trees that lined Main Street. Life moved at the pace of the seasons. The town had a single grocery store, a gas station, a post office, and 2 churches, but its true heart was the stone library. It was a place of quiet dignity, a microcosm of the valley itself, self-contained, proud, and deeply rooted in the history of the land its people had farmed for generations. This wasn't just a location on a map. It was an identity, one about to be erased by the relentless march of progress. That progress arrived in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority and its ambitious plan for a new hydroelectric dam. The project was sold to the public as a triumph of modern engineering, a beacon of prosperity that would bring power and jobs to the entire region. For the nation, it was a symbol of forward momentum. For the residents of Havenwood, it was a death sentence. Government officials and corporate engineers descended on the valley, their clipboards and blueprints representing an authority that felt both foreign and absolute. They spoke of eminent domain, of fair market value, and of the greater good, but their words were hollow echoes against the profound grief of a community being systematically dismantled. The rumbling of bulldozers on the valley's edge became the town's funereal drumbeat, a constant, grinding reminder that their world was about to be drowned. At the center of this quiet resistance was Elena Caldwell. Far from the crazy woman of family lore, Elena was the town's intellectual and historical anchor. At 45, she was a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering principles, who had served as Havenwood's librarian for over 2 decades. She knew every family's history, not from gossip, but from the birth, marriage, and death certificates stored in the library's archives. To her, the library was not merely a building filled with books. It was a sacred trust, the repository of the town's collective soul. She saw the dam project not as progress, but as an act of profound cultural vandalism. Her defiance wasn't born of madness, but of a fierce, protective love for the truth and the people whose stories she had sworn to preserve against any threat, even one as vast and final as a flood. The face of that threat, the charismatic herald of Havenwood's destruction, was a young and ambitious chief engineer named Richard Sinclair. At just 35, Sinclair was a rising star in the world of large-scale construction, a man who could sell a vision with a smooth voice and a confident smile. He moved through Havenwood with an air of detached authority, seeing the valley not as a tapestry of human lives, but as a perfect topographical basin for his project. He gave speeches at tense town hall meetings, placating angry residents with promises of a brighter future, all while overseeing the systematic erasure of their past. To him, the town was a necessary casualty, and its people were merely variables in a complex equation of cost, benefit, and power. Elena Caldwell, with her stubborn refusal to yield, was simply the last, most irritating variable to solve. The final months of Havenwood were thick with a sorrow that clung to the air like the valley's morning fog. The community fractured under the pressure. Some families took the government buyout early, their moving trucks a painful parade of surrender that rumbled down Main Street day after day. They were practical, resigned to the inevitable. Others, however, fought with every legal and emotional tool they had, their protests growing more desperate as the deadline approached. The town became a patchwork of abandoned homes and defiant holdouts, a place haunted by the ghosts of those who had already left and the palpable anxiety of those who remained. The constant sound of demolition, of ancestral homes being torn down to clear the way for the floodwaters, was a psychological torment, a daily reminder of their powerlessness against the forces reshaping their world. Elena found her staunchest, if quietest, ally in Silas, a young man of 20 who had grown up seeing the library as a sanctuary. He was one of the few who understood that Elena's fight was for something more than stone and paper. He remembered how she had personally tutored him in history, instilling in him a reverence for the past that now felt like a shared burden. While others saw her as eccentric or stubborn, Silas saw her as the town's last line of defense. He would often find her working late into the night, not just packing books, but meticulously reviewing town records, property deeds, and geological surveys related to the dam's construction. He didn't know what she was looking for, but he could see a new, steely resolve in her eyes, a focus that went beyond mere preservation. This resolve was fueled by a growing suspicion. Elena's position as the town's archivist gave her unique access to the foundational documents of the dam project. Initially, her goal was simply to ensure every piece of Havenwood's history was accounted for. But as she cross-referenced the construction company's public filings with the original land surveys stored in the library's basement, she began to notice troubling discrepancies. Figures didn't align, material specifications seemed to change from one document to the next, and insurance policies for the project seemed unusually high. She started to believe that the destruction of her town wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cover for something else. It was a crime. Her fight was no longer just about saving the past. It was about exposing a dangerous lie being built into the very concrete of the future. In the final week of October 1968, the atmosphere in Havenwood turned from somber to menacing. The last evacuation notices were posted, their stark black letters a final, non-negotiable command. Richard Sinclair's visits to the library became more frequent, his charming facade cracking to reveal a cold impatience. He no longer tried to persuade Elena. He tried to intimidate her, demanding she vacate the premises immediately. But his threats only confirmed her suspicions. She knew she was close to uncovering the full scope of his deception. The library was no longer just her post. It was her fortress, with the roar of machinery just yards away and the date of the final flood looming. Elena Caldwell locked the library doors, knowing she was guarding a truth far more valuable and far more dangerous than any book on her shelves. The relationship between Elena Caldwell and Richard Sinclair was a cold war, fought over blueprints and card catalogs. His visits to the library were calculated maneuvers, cloaked in a thin veneer of professional courtesy. He would praise her dedication to the town's history while simultaneously dismissing it as a quaint but irrelevant footnote in the grand narrative of progress he was authoring. "History is something we learn from, Elena, not something we live in," he once told her, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. But Elena was immune to his condescending charm. She saw the predatory ambition behind his carefully crafted persona. She would meet his pronouncements with a quiet, unwavering stare, her silence a more potent weapon than any argument. In her library, Surrounded by the documented truths of generations, she was on her home ground, and he was the trespasser peddling a future built on a foundation of lies. Richard Sinclair was, in his own mind, a visionary, not a villain. He was a man who believed fervently in the power of concrete and steel to tame nature and forge a better world. The Havenwood Valley, to him, was a masterpiece of natural engineering, waiting for a human hand to complete it. The town, its people, and its history were unfortunate but necessary sacrifices for the greater good of regional electrification and economic growth. He was under immense pressure from both government stakeholders and private investors to complete the dam on time and under budget. This pressure forged his ambition into a ruthless pragmatism. Any obstacle, whether a geological complication or a stubborn librarian, was not a problem to be solved with integrity, but a variable to be neutralized by any means necessary. His legacy was at stake, and he would not let one woman's sentimentality jeopardize the empire he was poised to build. Elena's investigation began not with a single revelation, but with a slow dawning dread, an accumulation of small, unsettling details. Working late under the dim glow of her desk lamp, she cross-referenced the dam's public engineering specs with the cargo manifests for construction materials she had quietly obtained from a sympathetic truck driver. The numbers refused to align. The plans called for high-grade steel reinforcements and a specific, expensive concrete mix designed for maximum tensile strength, yet the manifests showed deliveries of cheaper, inferior materials in smaller quantities. She began making meticulous copies of the most damning documents, invoices, altered blueprints, and internal memos, placing them inside a heavy leather pouch she kept hidden. She wasn't just an archivist anymore. She was an auditor of a massive fraud, a quiet accountant, tallying the cost of a crime that hadn't even been committed yet. The local law enforcement in 1968, represented by the town's lone sheriff, was ill-equipped to handle a conflict of this magnitude. Sheriff Miller was a good man, more accustomed to settling property disputes and dealing with teenage mischief than confronting the full force of the federal government and corporate power. When Elena first approached him with her concerns, he was sympathetic but ultimately dismissive. He saw a grieving woman channeling her anger at the inevitable. Richard Sinclair, with his confident demeanor and official backing from the Tennessee Valley Authority, was a figure of unimpeachable authority. The sheriff advised Elena to accept the buyout and move on, patting her hand and telling her not to borrow trouble. This encounter solidified a terrible realization for Elena. She was utterly alone. The systems meant to protect people like her were now aligned against her, leaving her no official recourse. Silas became her confidant, a silent partner in her dangerous inquiry. He was young enough to be invisible, and he used that to his advantage. At Elena's quiet request, he would spend his evenings near the construction site, watching from the cover of the woods. He reported back to her in hushed tones in the library's back office, describing late-night convoys of unmarked trucks and the hurried, secretive mixing of concrete under portable floodlights. He once overheard two foremen arguing, their voices sharp with fear, about cutting corners and the damned integrity reports Sinclair had ordered them to sign. Silas didn't understand the engineering specifics, but he understood fear and deception. His eyewitness accounts provided the human texture to the cold facts on Elena's documents, confirming that the corruption was not just on paper, but was being actively poured into the very foundations of the dam. The heavy steel safe in her office was Elena's ultimate contingency. She had purchased it from a specialty supplier in Knoxville months earlier, a decision her friends found bizarrely paranoid at the time. They saw it as another sign of her eccentricity, an old maid's fear of common burglars. But Elena knew its purpose was far greater. It was not meant to protect against thieves. It was meant to protect against time, pressure, and water. It was a vessel she intended to fill with the truth, a modern-day ark designed to carry the evidence of Sinclair's crimes through the coming flood. The act of installing it was a profound statement of her intent. She was preparing for a battle that she knew might outlive her, entrusting her legacy and the town's honor to a fortress of steel, hoping that one day the waters would recede and the truth would be brought to light. In its final days, Havenwood was a town at war with itself. The community, once bound by shared history, was now splintered by fear and resignation. Moving trucks became a common, painful sight, each departure feeling like a betrayal to those who remained. Some residents, seeing Elena's silent protest at the library, hailed her as a hero, the last bastion of their drowned heritage. They would leave small tokens of support, a jar of preserves, a freshly baked loaf of bread, on the library steps. But others, exhausted by the fight and anxious about their uncertain futures, saw her as a dangerous zealot. They whispered that her stubbornness was putting the final settlement payments at risk, that she was selfishly prolonging the agony for everyone. This division was Sinclair's silent victory. A community turned against itself could never mount a unified defense against him. The night before the valley was to be sealed off for good, a heavy, unnatural silence fell over Havenwood. The ceaseless roar of bulldozers and demolition crews finally ceased, leaving an eerie void. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and diesel fumes, felt charged with anticipation. Inside the library, bathed in the solitary light of her desk lamp, Elena Caldwell made her final entry in her journal. She carefully placed the journal, along with the meticulously copied documents, inside the leather pouch. She could hear the river outside, its current sounding louder, more menacing than ever before. It was a sound of finality. She knew Sinclair was aware of what she had discovered. The only question left was how far he would go to ensure that both she and the truth she guarded would be silenced forever, buried under the weight of a new, man-made lake. The journey from Nashville to the Havenwood Reservoir was a 3-hour drive through a landscape that shifted from urban sprawl to rolling green hills, a transition that mirrored the one happening inside Matt Hayes. He left behind a world of predictable angles and stepped into a past that was messy, muddy, and profoundly uncertain. When he arrived, the scene was one of controlled chaos. News vans with satellite dishes hummed near the shoreline, and a crowd of onlookers was held back by a hastily erected police tape. But Matt's eyes were fixed on a single object, sitting on a patch of dry, cracked earth, the rusted steel safe. It looked smaller than it had on television, yet its presence felt immense, a dark, heavy anchor pulling 40 years of history back to the surface. It was a tangible link to his great-aunt, a final, defiant statement in oxidized steel, and Matt felt an overwhelming, protective instinct toward it, as if it were a family tomb that had just been unearthed. The documentary crew, led by a director with an insatiable appetite for drama, was already coordinating with a local locksmith. Their initial attempts to manipulate the frozen combination dial were futile, the mechanism seized by decades of corrosion. The plan shifted to a more forceful entry. A specialized technician arrived with heavy-duty cutting tools, and the air soon filled with the high-pitched scream of a grinder against metal, sending a shower of orange sparks into the late afternoon air. The sound was violent, a desecration of the safe's long silence. Matt stood by, his jaw clenched, every screech of the tool feeling like a violation. He watched as the technician methodically worked, cutting a precise rectangle into the safe's door, his focus absolute. For the television crew, this was a climactic scene. For Matt, it was an agonizingly slow exhumation of a family secret he was no longer sure he wanted to face. With a final groaning tear of metal, the section of the door was pried open. A collective breath was held as the director pushed his camera lens toward the dark opening. The interior was not filled with treasure or historical artifacts as some had speculated. It was mostly empty, coated in a thick layer of dark, foul-smelling silt. A wave of anticlimax washed over the crew, but then the technician reached inside with a gloved hand and carefully pulled out a single object. It was a heavy leather pouch, the kind a banker or lawyer might have used in the 1960s. It was dark with water saturation and stiff with age, but its stitching had miraculously held. The pouch was sealed with a tarnished brass buckle. This wasn't the dramatic discovery the show had hoped for, but for Matt, the sight of it was a jolt of pure electricity. It was intimate, It was personal. It was exactly what a meticulous, principled librarian would use to protect something she deemed priceless. Matt stepped forward, his voice firm. "That's mine. It belongs to my family." He took the pouch from the surprise technician before the director could object. Holding it was a surreal experience. The leather was cold and damp, and it weighed more than he expected. A solid, dense package of forgotten history. He could almost feel the imprint of Elena's hands on it, the sense of her final, desperate act of preservation. This object was the core of the story, the heart of the mystery. In that moment, he felt an unbreakable bond with the woman he had only ever known through a distorted family legend. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this pouch did not contain the ramblings of a disturbed mind. It held evidence. It held the truth. He carefully wrapped it in a towel from his car, shielding it from the prying eyes of the cameras in the world. The immediate challenge became clear: preservation. The pouch and its contents were incredibly fragile. 40 years submerged in the mineral-rich, low-oxygen environment of the reservoir had created a unique state of decay. Opening the pouch recklessly could cause the waterlogged paper inside to disintegrate into an illegible pulp upon contact with the air. The local museum curator, called to the scene by the news crews, confirmed Matt's fears. "This requires a specialist," she advised, her expression grave. "A forensic document expert. Any attempt to handle this without the proper equipment will destroy whatever's left." She gave him a name: Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned paper and document restoration expert based at Vanderbilt University. The path forward was now clear, shifting from the raw emotion of discovery to the cold, methodical demands of science. The truth was within his grasp, but it was trapped in a delicate, waterlogged prison. The drive to Dr. Reed's laboratory was the most nerve-wracking of Matt's life. He placed the wrapped pouch on the passenger seat, driving with exaggerated care as if transporting a priceless, unstable artifact. The lab was a world away from the mud and decay of Havenwood. It was a sterile, climate-controlled environment of stainless steel, humming machinery, and the faint, clean scent of archival chemicals. Dr. Reed was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed the pouch with a professional, almost clinical, detachment. She listened to Matt's story without interruption, her expression unreadable. "The pressure and the lack of oxygen can sometimes act as a strange preservative," she explained, her voice calm and measured. "But 40 years is a very long time. I can't make any promises." Her words were a necessary dose of reality, a reminder that his quest for answers could very well end here, in a slurry of disintegrated paper. Dr. Reed and her team began the painstaking process of restoration. The leather pouch was first placed in a vacuum freeze dryer, a machine designed to slowly remove the water without allowing the cellular structure of the paper and ink to collapse. This process alone would take over a week. Matt returned to his life, but his focus was gone. His architectural projects felt trivial. The clean lines of his blueprints, a pale imitation of the complex, hidden structure he was now trying to uncover. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for a call from Dr. Reed. Days bled into weeks. The national news cycle moved on from the ghost town of Havenwood, but for Matt, time had stopped, suspended in the quiet, humming chamber of that laboratory, waiting for a voice from the past to finally speak. His entire sense of self, of his family's history, was contingent on the fragile pages inside that pouch. Finally, 3 weeks after he had handed over the pouch, his phone rang. It was Dr. Reed. Her voice, usually so calm and academic, carried an unmistakable charge of excitement and urgency. "Mr. Hayes, you need to come back to the lab," she said. "We've been able to separate some of the pages using a humidification chamber and have started multispectral imaging. We're getting something." Matt felt his heart pound against his ribs. "What is it? What does it say?" he asked, his voice tight. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the rustle of delicate paper, audible even through the phone. "It's a journal entry," Dr. Reed said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The ink is faint, but the words are clear. It's dated October 28, 1968. The first line reads, 'R.S. knows that I know. He was here tonight. He told me the dam would be my tomb. Okas rarisk, asterisk, the dod. Kirisk, the dod.'" What they found next would change everything. The words on that page were more than just an entry in a diary. They were a direct accusation, a voice reaching out from a watery grave to point a finger at a killer. But proving a 40-year-old crime based on a handful of restored documents seemed impossible. If you want to see how Matt uses this shocking revelation to start piecing together the puzzle of Elena's final days, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications turned on. This investigation is about to get much more dangerous, and you won't want to miss what happens when the past begins to fight back. Now, let's uncover the evidence that Richard Sinclair thought he had buried forever. The words hung in the sterile air of the laboratory, an echo from a cold October night 4 decades ago. "R.S. knows that I know. The dam would be my tomb." Matt felt the floor shift beneath him, the stable, predictable world he had built for himself, fracturing under the weight of Elena's final desperate message. It was a confirmation so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. The family legend of a madwoman was instantly obliterated, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of a murder. His great-aunt wasn't crazy, she was a witness. She had been silenced, not for her sentimentality, but for a truth she had uncovered. In that moment, the investigation ceased to be about clearing a family name. It became a hunt for a killer, a man who had walked free for 40 years, his crime safely submerged under a lake of his own making. The rusted safe had not just released documents, it had released a ghost, and she was demanding justice. Dr. Reed, sensing the seismic shift in Matt's understanding, gently guided him toward a large monitor displaying a high-resolution image of the journal page. "We used multispectral imaging," she explained, her tone shifting from dramatic revelation to professional instruction. "The iron gall ink used in that era has degraded, but it leaves behind trace iron deposits. By illuminating the page with different wavelengths of light from ultraviolet to infrared, the camera's sensors can capture the faint residue the human eye can no longer see. The computer then compiles these layers into a single, legible image." She pointed to the screen, where Elena's script, once a ghostly watermark on the page, now appeared as sharp and clear as if it were freshly written. The science was cold and precise, an irrefutable process that gave a voice back to the dead, transforming faded whispers into a shout that could cross generations. Matt looked past the digital reconstruction to the actual document, laid out carefully in a climate-controlled case. He could see the delicate feathering of the ink, the determined press of the pen into the paper. This was her hand. He imagined her in the library, the world outside her stone walls being dismantled piece by piece, the air thick with the dust of demolition and the impending doom of the flood. Yet, in the face of it all, her handwriting remained steady, controlled, the script of a woman who dealt in facts and evidence. This tangible connection to her final hours was overwhelming. He felt a profound sense of intimacy and loss, a deep sorrow for the fear she must have felt, mixed with an immense pride in her courage. She had faced down a powerful man, armed with nothing but her integrity and the truth she had painstakingly assembled, knowing it would likely cost her everything. The next piece of the puzzle was not a personal entry but a cold, hard business document. Dr. Reed showed him a heavily wrinkled, yet remarkably preserved, carbon copy of an insurance policy. It was issued by a Nashville-based underwriter in September of 1968, just 6 weeks before Havenwood was flooded. The policy was taken out by the dam's primary construction contractor, and the terms were shockingly specific. It was a multi-million-dollar policy, with a premium of nearly $500,000, an exorbitant sum for the time, insuring against catastrophic structural failure due to substandard material integrity. Matt read the clause again. It wasn't a standard liability policy. It was a highly specific wager against their own work. It was as if a shipbuilder took out a massive policy specifically for his ship sinking on its maiden voyage. It was a document that screamed of premeditated fraud and anticipated disaster. With a growing sense of dread, Matt focused on the beneficiary of the policy. It wasn't the construction company itself, but a vaguely named holding corporation, Appalachian Development Group. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out his smartphone, the modern tool, a stark contrast to the analog evidence before him. A quick search provided the answer in seconds. The Appalachian Development Group was a shell corporation, founded in 1967 and dissolved in early 1969. Its assets, including the massive insurance payout, were immediately rolled into a new venture, Sinclair Construction, a company founded by its promising young president, Richard Sinclair, R.S. The initials from Elena's journal now had a name, a face, and a clear financial motive. The dam wasn't just a project. It was the seed capital for an empire, funded by a crime and paid for with a woman's life. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. Carefully separated from the journal were several rolled-up architectural drawings. They were copies of the official dam blueprints, but they were covered in Elena's precise, scholarly annotations. Using a red pen, she had circled sections of the schematics, cross-referencing them with notes in the margins. Per manifest, 7B, rebar grade reduced by 40%. One note read, "Concrete mix specification altered. See attached supply invoice. Sand to cement ratio exceeds safety limits." Read another. She had meticulously documented every corner cut, every substitution of cheap material for the required high-grade components. It was a forensic accounting of the fraud, a step-by-step indictment of Sinclair's crime. She hadn't just suspected something was wrong. She had proven it, using the company's own documents against them, creating a perfect, self-contained case file of their corruption. Holding the annotated blueprints, Matt felt the full, crushing weight of the truth. This was no longer just about a 40-year-old murder. The dam built on Richard Sinclair's lies, and Elena Caldwell's grave was still there, holding back the Ocoee River. For 4 decades, it had been a ticking time bomb, its structural integrity compromised from the day the first batch of cheap concrete was poured. Thousands of people lived downstream, in towns and cities that relied on the dam for power, completely unaware that the structure looming over them was a monument to greed, potentially on the verge of a catastrophic failure predicted by a librarian 40 years ago. Matt's quest, which began with a flicker of family shame and curiosity, had just escalated into a matter of immense public safety. The past was not dead. It was a clear and present danger. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not proceed alone. This evidence was explosive. But Sinclair was now an 85-year-old pillar of the community, insulated by wealth, power, and the passage of time. To challenge him would require more than a personal conviction. It would require the full, impartial weight of the law. Matt looked at Dr. Reed, who had watched him piece together the narrative with a quiet, professional intensity. She gave him a small, firm nod, a silent acknowledgement that her work was done, and his was just beginning. He walked to the corner of the lab, took a deep breath, and dialed the number for the county sheriff's department. When the dispatcher answered, his voice was steady, imbued with the conviction of the woman whose legacy he now carried. "My name is Matt Hayes," he stated. "I need to report a murder." Detective Sarah Harding was a woman who had learned to filter out the noise. In her 15 years with the county sheriff's department, she'd heard every kind of story, from alien abductions to decades-old family feuds masquerading as capital crimes. When the call came in from Matt Hayes, her initial reaction was one of professional weariness. A 40-year-old murder claimed by a grandnephew based on documents pulled from a lake? It had all the hallmarks of a grief-fueled fantasy. She arrived at the Vanderbilt lab expecting to gently manage an emotional relative, to file a perfunctory report, and to close the book on yet another ghost story. She saw Matt, his face a mask of intense conviction, and prepared herself for a long, frustrating conversation. The past, in her experience, was a messy place best left undisturbed, especially when it had been submerged for a generation. Her job was to deal with the concrete crimes of the present, not the murky legends of the past. But the sterile, quiet authority of Dr. Reed's laboratory was a world away from the emotional chaos Harding had anticipated. Dr. Reed didn't present a theory. She presented data. She walked the detective through the multispectral imaging process, showing how invisible traces of iron were coaxed back into legible script by precise wavelengths of light. Harding stared at the monitor, where Elena Caldwell's final, damning words appeared with chilling clarity. She then examined the annotated blueprints and the fraudulent insurance policy, each document meticulously preserved and catalogued. This was not the rambling of a grieving relative. This was a cold, methodical presentation of evidence. The science was irrefutable. It stripped away the folklore and the legend, leaving behind the stark, undeniable framework of a crime. Detective Harding's professional skepticism evaporated under the fluorescent lights of the lab, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of a homicide investigator with a 40-year-old trail to follow. The next morning, Harding officially reopened case file number 681104, blowing a thin layer of dust off a faded manila folder labeled Caldwell Elena Missing Person. The original investigation had been shockingly brief, closed in less than a month, with the conclusion of accidental drowning. There were no witness statements of substance, no follow-up on potential leads. It was as if the case itself had been deliberately submerged along with the town. She ran a background check on Richard Sinclair. The name was more than just familiar. It was legendary. He wasn't some retired engineer living out his golden years in obscurity. He was the founder and chairman emeritus of Sinclair Construction, a multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate with deep political ties and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. The man Elena accused was not just a potential murderer. He was an icon, a titan of industry, shielded by layers of wealth, power, and carefully curated public image. This wasn't just a cold case. It was a battle against an institution. The interview took place at Richard Sinclair's palatial estate, overlooking the Cumberland River, a modern fortress of glass and stone. At 85, Sinclair was physically frail, but possessed an unyielding, sharp intellect. He greeted Detective Harding with a disarming grandfatherly charm, offering her tea as if she were a social guest. When she brought up Elena Caldwell, his expression shifted to one of practiced, sorrowful remembrance. "Ah, Elena." He sighed, his voice a smooth, convincing baritone. "A brilliant but deeply troubled woman. I tried to reason with her, to convince her to leave Havenwood for her own safety. Her refusal to evacuate was a tragedy, but it was her choice." He leaned forward, his eyes holding a look of sincere pity. "To suggest anything else, Detective, is to dishonor the memory of a woman who was, in the end, a victim of her own stubborn grief, not of some phantom conspiracy." His performance was flawless, a masterclass in deflection and condescension. Leaving the estate, Harding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Sinclair's denial was too polished, his narrative too perfectly constructed. He had answered her questions without ever providing a concrete detail, wrapping the entire encounter in a fog of condescending pity for Elena. Back at her office, she shared her impressions with Matt. "He's a stone wall," she admitted, "but a wall with cracks." She had pulled the original case notes and found Sinclair's alibi for the night of October 28, 1968. He claimed he was at a project management dinner in Knoxville, over 100 miles away, but the alibi was a single line in the report, provided by his own project foreman, and never independently verified. No one had checked the restaurant, interviewed other attendees, or questioned why the chief engineer would be so far away on the eve of the valley's final sealing. The investigation had been a sham from the very beginning. Frustrated by the official dead end, Matt realized the answer wouldn't be found in police files or corporate records. It had to be with someone who had been there, someone who had breathed the same dust-filled air as Elena in those final days. He spent 2 days in the county archives, his architect's eye for detail scanning microfilm reels of Havenwood's final census and employment records. And then he found it. A payroll ledger for the town library, dated September 1968. Listed under Elena Caldwell's name was a single part-time assistant, Silas Miller. A quick search of public records revealed an address for an S. Miller in a small, sleepy town just 30 miles from the reservoir. Hope, sharp and urgent, surged through him. He had found a living witness, a direct link to the library's last stand, a man who might hold the key to what really happened on that final, fateful night. The man who answered the door was a ghost himself, a thin, stooped figure in his late 70s, with eyes that held the permanent shadow of an old fear. When Matt introduced himself and mentioned the name Elena Caldwell, a tremor ran through Silas's frail body. He immediately became defensive, his voice a reedy whisper. "I don't know anything about that," he insisted, his gaze darting nervously past Matt as if expecting to see someone else standing behind him. "That was a long time ago. A sad time. It's best to let the past be." He tried to close the door, but Matt gently held it open, pleading with him. The fear on Silas's face was not the faded memory of a town's loss. It was a raw, active terror, as potent today as it must have been 40 years ago. Matt knew in his gut that this man hadn't just known Elena. He had witnessed something that had silenced him for a lifetime. 2 days after Matt's visit to Silas, the first real counterattack came. A courier delivered a thick, imposing envelope to his office. Inside was a letter from one of Nashville's most powerful and aggressive law firms. It was a formal cease-and-desist order, written on behalf of their client, Mr. Richard Sinclair. The letter accused Matt of a, quote, campaign of malicious harassment and defamation, and warned of immediate legal action, including a multi-million-dollar lawsuit if he continued his unfounded inquiries. It was a meticulously crafted instrument of intimidation designed to crush him under the weight of legal fees and public disgrace. The message was brutally clear. Richard Sinclair's empire was now fully mobilized. They were not just defending a man's reputation, they were protecting the fraudulent foundation upon which that entire empire had been built, and they would use their immense resources to silence Matt, just as they had silenced his great-aunt. The corporate threat solidified Detective Harding's resolve. If Sinclair was innocent, he was overreacting. If he was guilty, this was a predictable move. She decided to bypass Sinclair's lawyers and attack the problem from a different angle: public safety. Citing vague concerns from local observers about the dam's age, she submitted a formal request to the State Engineering Board for the unredacted structural integrity reports from the last 20 years. The response she received was both swift and alarming. Her request was denied, citing a rarely used clause related to, quote, critical infrastructure security. The official reports were classified. It was an absurd justification for a 40-year-old hydroelectric dam. The corruption wasn't just a historical footnote. It was an active, breathing conspiracy. Someone with immense influence was still pulling strings, ensuring that the dam's original sins remained buried in classified secrecy, protecting Sinclair's legacy at the potential cost of public safety. Feeling the official channels closing around him, Matt made a desperate call to an old colleague from his university days, an independent structural engineer named David Chen, known for his brilliant, uncompromising work. He emailed Chen the high-resolution photos of Elena's annotated blueprints, along with the details she had noted about the compromised materials. He asked for an off-the-record assessment. The reply came less than 12 hours later, not as an email, but as an urgent, early-morning phone call. "Matt, this is bad." David's voice was stripped of its usual casual tone. "If these notes are even 70% accurate, this dam isn't just compromised, it's a ticking time bomb. This specified concrete mix, the rebar grade. This thing was built to fail. It's a miracle of physics. It's still holding back that reservoir. A significant flood, a minor tremor. It wouldn't just crack, it would disintegrate. You're not looking at a past crime. You're looking at a potential future catastrophe." The engineer's words echoed in Matt's head, transforming his mission from one of personal justice to one of urgent public service. He drove back to Silas's small house, the legal threats and historical mystery now dwarfed by the terrifying prospect of imminent disaster. He found the old man tending his garden, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, Matt didn't ask about the past. He told Silas about the future. He laid out the engineer's report, explaining the danger to the towns downstream, to the thousands of families who lived in the valley below the dam, completely unaware of the compromised concrete looming over them. He wasn't asking for a secret. He was asking for help in preventing a tragedy. The weight of this new burden finally broke through the old man's wall of fear. Silas dropped his trowel, his shoulders slumping. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at Matt, his voice a choked whisper, heavy with 40 years of silence. "I saw him," he confessed. "That night, I saw Mr. Sinclair leaving the library. His clothes were covered in mud." Silas Miller's confession landed with the force of a physical impact, shattering 40 years of carefully constructed silence. "I saw him," he repeated, the words a painful exhalation of a lifelong burden. In that moment, the entire investigation pivoted. It was no longer a case built on the spectral evidence of restored documents and engineering reports. It was now anchored by a living witness, a man who could place Richard Sinclair at the scene of the crime, covered in the mud of a freshly dug grave. For Matt, this was the moment his great-aunt's ghost finally found its voice, speaking through the trembling lips of the last person who had seen her world before it was consumed by water. The weight of Silas's fear, a terror that had kept him silent for 4 decades, was now transferred to Sinclair, a debt of justice finally coming due. The foundation of the old man's empire had just developed a fatal crack. The next day, Detective Harding sat across from Silas in the sterile quiet of an interview room, a digital recorder capturing every hesitant word. Taking his official statement was a slow, arduous process, like excavating a fragile artifact. Silas recounted the night of October 28, 1968, with a clarity that belied his age. He described the unsettling quiet that fell over the valley, the way the air tasted of cold river water and diesel fuel. Worried about Elena, he had walked to the library, only to see a figure stumbling out of the back entrance. It was Richard Sinclair, but what Silas had withheld from Matt, a detail he had buried even deeper, now surfaced. "He had a scratch," Silas whispered, his finger tracing a line down his own cheek. "A deep one, on his face, angry and red. And his eyes, they were wild, like a cornered animal." This wasn't just a man leaving a building, it was a man fleeing a violent struggle. Armed with this new, visceral detail, Harding had the leverage she needed to break the conspiracy of silence. She drove to a quiet retirement community in Chattanooga to interview Arthur Vance, the project foreman who had provided Sinclair's original alibi. Vance, now a frail man of 89, initially met her questions with a dismissive wave, repeating the well-rehearsed story of a business dinner in Knoxville. But Harding didn't back down. She laid out Silas's eyewitness account, the description of the mud, the panic, the fresh scratch on Sinclair's face. Then she delivered the final blow, informing him that providing a false alibi in a murder investigation was a felony with no statute of limitations. Vance's composure crumbled. The carefully maintained wall of loyalty, built 40 years ago, collapsed into dust, revealing the terrified young foreman who had been coerced into telling a lie that had haunted him ever since. Arthur Vance's confession was a torrent, a flood of guilt held back for a lifetime. He admitted Sinclair had never gone to Knoxville. In fact, Sinclair had called him late that night, his voice tight with a panic Vance had never heard before, ordering him to create the alibi and to ensure no one questioned it. But Vance revealed something far more damning. He named 3 other senior managers on the project who had also been part of the cover-up. Each had received a completion bonus of $50,000, a staggering sum in 1968, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. This money was not for finishing the project, but for their silence, for signing off on falsified material manifests and doctored safety reports. Elena's murder was not a singular crime of passion. It was the final, brutal act of a wide-ranging corporate conspiracy, a calculated decision to protect a fraudulent enterprise at any cost. The foreman's testimony unlocked the next door. Harding's team, armed with a new warrant, delved into the dusty archives of Sinclair Construction's predecessor company. There, buried in ledgers and expense reports, they found the financial proof. The bonuses were disguised as payments for non-existent heavy machinery rentals and phantom subcontractor fees. The paper trail was a perfect match for Vance's story, a 40-year-old map detailing exactly how Sinclair had bought the silence of his key men. It was cold, hard, irrefutable evidence of a criminal conspiracy. The case was no longer just about Elena. It was about a systemic corruption that had been the very bedrock of Sinclair's empire from its inception. The web of deceit was far wider and more intricate than Matt had ever imagined, connecting a handful of powerful men through a shared, profitable secret. Feeling the official investigation moving too slowly against Sinclair's immense legal and political influence, Matt made a dangerous choice. He contacted an investigative reporter he knew through a past architectural project, a journalist known for her tenacity and fearlessness. He provided her with two things: a high-resolution copy of Elena's annotated blueprint detailing the fraudulent concrete mix, and the catastrophic structural assessment from his engineer colleague David Chen. He made the leak anonymously, knowing it was a high-stakes gamble that would unleash the full fury of Sinclair's power. But the engineer's warning about a ticking time bomb echoed in his mind. This was no longer just about seeking justice for the past. It was about an urgent, moral obligation to prevent a far greater tragedy in the future. The public had a right to know the danger they were in. The story broke online with the force of a dam bursting. The headline, "The Havenwood Dam, a ticking time bomb built on a 40-year-old lie," spread like wildfire across social media and was picked up by national news outlets within hours. The article included damning excerpts from Elena's notes, juxtaposed with the modern engineer's terrifying analysis. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Panic swept through the communities downstream from the reservoir, as thousands of residents realized the structure that powered their lives was a potential instrument of their death. The governor's office was flooded with calls. Under the glare of a national media spotlight, the state could no longer hide behind bureaucratic excuses. The secret of Havenwood was out, and the political pressure for action became an unstoppable force. The ghost of Elena Caldwell was now commanding the attention of the entire state. Sinclair's response was swift and brutal. The pretense of legal maneuvering was abandoned for raw intimidation. One evening, Matt returned to his apartment to find the deadbolt unlocked. Inside, his office had been systematically torn apart. His desk drawers were emptied, files scattered, and his laptop smashed. But the intruders were not common thieves. His wallet and other valuables were untouched. They had been looking for something specific. Lying in the center of the floor was a single, faded photograph of Elena, the one he kept on his desk. A thick, jagged line had been drawn across her throat in red ink. The message was unambiguous and chillingly personal. They were not just trying to silence him. They were showing him he could suffer the same fate as his great-aunt. The conflict had escalated from a legal battle to a direct threat on his life. Detective Harding found herself fighting a war on two fronts. While she was building a case against Sinclair, a powerful, unseen hand was working against her from within. Her captain called her into his office, his face grim. He spoke of political sensitivities and, quote, pressure from the state capitol. He mentioned Sinclair Construction's significant contributions to political campaigns and its status as a major employer. He didn't order her to drop the case, but his words were a clear and unmistakable warning. She was pursuing a man who was considered untouchable, and if she failed, her career would be the collateral damage. The corruption Elena had uncovered hadn't vanished with the flood. It had simply grown, its roots intertwining with the state's power structure for 40 years, creating a protective canopy for a killer. The immense public outcry, however, proved to be more powerful than any political connection. Forced into action, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dispatched a rapid response team to conduct an emergency structural analysis of the Havenwood Dam. Using advanced ultrasonic scanners and drilling for core samples, they spent 3 days assessing the structure. Their preliminary findings, delivered at a tense press conference, were a horrifying confirmation of Elena's 40-year-old warnings. The concrete showed evidence of severe aggregate alkali reaction, concrete cancer, and had a compressive strength less than half of what the original 1968 plans required. The dam was critically compromised. Within the hour, the governor issued an immediate evacuation order for 3 towns in the valley below. The potential catastrophe Elena had died to prevent was now a terrifyingly real possibility. The dam's physical evidence was the final, decisive blow. Combined with Silas Miller's eyewitness testimony and Arthur Vance's confession about the alibi and the conspiracy of silence, the chain of evidence was now complete and unbreakable. The case against Richard Sinclair had transformed from a historical mystery into an urgent matter of public safety and multiple felonies. Defying the veiled threats from her superiors, Detective Harding walked into a judge's chambers with the mountain of evidence her team had compiled. She emerged not just with warrants for fraud and conspiracy, but with a warrant for the arrest of Richard Sinclair on the charge of first-degree murder. The pursuit of a forgotten librarian's truth had culminated in the imminent takedown of a corporate titan, proving that no secret, no matter how deep it's buried, can be concealed from the light forever. The convoy moved through the manicured gates of the Sinclair estate like a violation, a procession of official, grim purpose, invading a sanctuary of private power. Red and blue lights flashed silently, strobing across the mansion's facade of polished glass and imported stone, painting the perfect lawns in the colors of an emergency. Inside the lead car, Matt Hayes sat beside Detective Harding, the silence between them thick with a tension that had been building for 40 years. He looked at the house, a monument to a legacy built on a submerged grave, and felt a cold, righteous fury. This was not just an arrest, it was an excavation, a final, forceful unearthing of a truth that had been buried alive. The crunch of tires on the long, winding driveway sounded unnaturally loud, each rotation a countdown to a confrontation a generation in the making. Richard Sinclair was not a man to be caught off guard. When Detective Harding and her tactical team approached the massive oak doors, they swung open before a hand could be raised to knock. Sinclair stood in the center of a cavernous, marble-floored foyer, a frail king in a cashmere sweater, flanked by 2 severe-looking lawyers. His posture was defiant, his eyes, though clouded with age, burned with an unyielding arrogance. He ignored the uniformed officers, his gaze locking immediately onto Matt. In that single, silent look, a 40-year war was declared and joined. There was no surprise on Sinclair's face, only a cold, reptilian fury. He had built an empire to insulate himself from this very moment, and the sight of Elena Caldwell's blood, in the form of a determined young architect, standing in his hall was the ultimate, intolerable trespass. Detective Harding stepped forward, the arrest warrant a stark white rectangle in her hand. Her voice, calm and professional, was a weapon in the echoing silence of the foyer. "Richard Sinclair," she began, the formal words cutting through the tension, "you are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Elena Caldwell on or about October 28, 1968. The lawyers erupted in a chorus of practiced outrage, citing their client's age, his standing in the community, the absurdity of the charge. But Sinclair raised a thin, trembling hand, and they fell silent. He held Harding's gaze, a flicker of something ancient and predatory in his eyes. He was not afraid of the law. He was insulted by it. He had outrun this ghost for 4 decades, and he would not be brought down by a small-town detective and a boy playing at being a hero. With a dry, rattling laugh, Sinclair turned his full attention to Matt, his voice a low, condescending rasp. You have her eyes," he hissed, the words meant to wound. Stubborn, naive. She thought she was protecting a history nobody cared about. She stood in the way of progress, of a future that has powered this state for 40 years. I offered her money, a new life, anything she wanted. But she chose those dusty books. She chose to be a martyr for a forgotten patch of dirt. Her death was a suicide of principle, boy. Don't you dare try to pin her foolishness on me. It was a masterful performance of deflection, an attempt to rewrite history one last time, to cast Elena as the author of her own demise in the very hall her murder had paid for. But Matt was no longer intimidated. He took a step forward, his own voice raw with a grief he was only now beginning to understand. He held up a laminated copy of Elena's final journal entry, the words stark against the white page. She didn't die for a patch of dirt. She died for the truth. He shot back, his voice rising, echoing off the marble. She died because she knew your progress was a fraud. She knew you were building a concrete tomb, using cheap materials that would fail. She wasn't protecting the past, you old monster. She was trying to save the future from men like you. The accusation hung in the air, personal and absolute, shattering Sinclair's carefully constructed narrative and exposing the rotten core of his legacy for all to see. As Sinclair's face twisted in a mask of pure rage, the sterile foyer dissolved in Matt's mind, replaced by the damp, earthy reality of the Havenwood Library on a cold October night. He could smell the wet wool of Elena's coat, the metallic scent of approaching rain, and the cloying sweetness of decaying leaves. He saw Sinclair, younger and desperate, his face illuminated by a single desk lamp, pleading, then threatening. He heard the sharp, defiant tear of paper as Elena refused to hand over the evidence. The scene shifted outside, to the muddy ground behind the library, the sickening wet thud of a shovel striking flesh, the grunting strain of a man dragging a body, the final, desperate gasp of a woman being buried alive under the very soil she had fought to protect, her last sight, the cold, indifferent stars above a valley, about to be drowned in silence. "She would have ruined me!" The shriek ripped from Sinclair's throat, a raw, involuntary confession fueled by a lifetime of narcissistic rage. The grandfatherly facade disintegrated, revealing the cornered animal beneath. She and her pathetic little town were nothing, a sacrifice for the greater good. I built an empire from that valley. I gave thousands of people jobs, power, a future. She was a footnote, an insect who got in the way of history. His lawyers stared in horror as their client, in his own magnificent foyer, confessed to the very crime they were hired to deny. Every body camera in the room captured the admission, the final, damning testimony from the killer himself, his guilt erupting after 40 years of pressurized silence. The truth, like the town, had finally risen to the surface. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Richard Sinclair's thin wrists was the loudest sound Matt had ever heard. It was a sound of finality, a full stop at the end of a 40-year sentence of injustice. The immense power Sinclair had wielded, the political influence, the billions of dollars, all of it was rendered meaningless by this simple, mechanical act. He slumped, a puppet with its strings cut, the weight of his years and his crimes finally crushing him. As the officers led him toward the door, he looked like what he was, a small, withered old man, his empire of lies collapsing around him, brought down by the ghost of a librarian whose name he had tried so hard to erase. Justice had arrived, quiet and absolute. Just as a sense of victory began to settle over Matt, a frantic voice crackled through Detective Harding's radio. The transmission was broken, filled with static and panic, but the words were terrifyingly clear. "Dispatch, this is Corps of Engineers at Havenwood Dam. We have a major breach. Repeat, we have a major structural breach. The south face is failing." Suddenly, the air in the foyer felt cold and thin. The past had just collided with the present, with catastrophic force. The crime was not over. The ticking time bomb Elena had tried to expose was finally, after 40 years of holding its breath, about to detonate. The consequences of Sinclair's greed were no longer a matter of historical record. They were a clear and present danger, a wall of water about to be unleashed. The scene shifted to the valley below the dam, where the evacuation sirens, once a drill, now shrieked with genuine terror. Headlights cut through the twilight as a panicked exodus of cars clogged the two-lane roads leading to higher ground. People who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of the dam now fled from it, their faces masks of disbelief and fear. This was the nightmare scenario from the engineering reports, the catastrophic failure Elena had foreseen in her annotated blueprints. The legacy of Havenwood was not just a drowned town. It was this moment of mass panic, a terror that had been built into the very foundations of the region's prosperity, a debt of risk finally being called due. The water was coming, and it would not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Standing on the manicured lawn of Sinclair's estate, Matt watched the old man being placed in the back of a police cruiser, his victory turning to ash in his mouth. He could hear the distant, wailing scream of the sirens from the valley. He had won. He had cleared Elena's name and brought her killer to justice. But the cost was terrifying. Had he unearthed this truth just in time to witness the very disaster she died to prevent? The arrest felt like a hollow gesture in the face of the unfolding catastrophe. He had avenged the past, but in doing so he may have inadvertently triggered the destruction of the present. The weight of that possibility was heavier than any family shame he had ever carried. Then, another voice cut through the radio's static, this one calmer, more controlled. It was the lead engineer from the Army Corps. "All units, be advised, we have successfully opened the primary floodgates. We are attempting an emergency-controlled release to relieve pressure. I repeat, we are attempting to mitigate the breach. It's holding for now, but I don't know for how long." A fragile sliver of hope cut through the panic. It was a desperate gamble, a battle of modern science against the structural sins of 1968. They were not just fighting a failing dam. They were fighting the ghost of Richard Sinclair's ambition, a race against time, measured in tons of crumbling, substandard concrete, and the immense, unforgiving pressure of the water. As the police car carrying Sinclair pulled away from the estate, its flashing lights disappearing down the long, dark driveway, Matt looked toward the distant valley. He couldn't see the dam, but he could feel it, a wounded beast groaning under the strain of a 40-year-old lie. Richard Sinclair, framed in the rear window of the cruiser, was not looking back at the life he was leaving behind. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, toward the town he had destroyed and the woman who had, from a watery grave, finally brought his empire down. The arrest was over, but the story was not. The water, for so long a silent accomplice to a crime, was now the final judge, and its verdict was about to be delivered upon the valley below. The night of Richard Sinclair's arrest was a fragile truce between past and present, a battle fought not with lawyers but with hydraulics and steel. At the Havenwood Dam, engineers from the Army Corps worked under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were fighting a 40-year-old ghost. The emergency-controlled release was a high-stakes gamble, a desperate attempt to bleed pressure from a structure that was groaning under the weight of its own fraudulent conception. Every groaning shudder of the concrete, every surge of water through the opened floodgates, was an echo of Elena Caldwell's warning. The dam, which Sinclair had intended as a monument to his ambition, was now his final, crumbling confession, threatening to deliver a catastrophic verdict upon the thousands of innocent people who lived in its shadow, completely unaware that their safety had been compromised before they were even born. The legal proceedings began with a predictable display of corporate arrogance. Richard Sinclair, appearing in court via video link from a pretrial medical facility, pleaded not guilty to all charges. His high-priced legal team, renowned for their aggressive tactics, immediately went on the offensive, painting a picture of a benevolent, elderly philanthropist being persecuted by a sensationalist media and a fame-seeking relative with a family history of mental instability. They filed motions to have the waterlogged evidence dismissed as unreliable, arguing that 40 years of submersion had rendered Elena's documents little more than speculative fiction. The initial public reaction was divided, a testament to Sinclair's carefully cultivated image. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the figure of the respected community pillar with the cold-blooded killer described in the prosecution's opening statements, creating a tense, uncertain prelude to the trial. While the legal battle raged, the physical fate of the Havenwood Dam was sealed. The final report from the Army Corps of Engineers was a damning indictment, a technical autopsy of a structure that had been dying since the day it was built. They confirmed Elena's every suspicion, detailing the substandard concrete, the insufficient steel reinforcement, and the faulty geological assessments. The dam was declared a critical and imminent threat. In an ironic twist of fate, the state announced a multi-billion-dollar project to slowly decommission the structure and drain the Havenwood Reservoir permanently. The very force Sinclair had used to conceal his crime would now be removed, a slow, deliberate process that would lay bare not only the ghost town of Havenwood, but the full, unvarnished truth of his greed, leaving a permanent scar on the landscape as a reminder of the immense public cost of a single, private crime. The trial of Richard Sinclair became a national spectacle, less a simple murder case, and more a public referendum on corporate power and accountability. The media descended on the small county courthouse, broadcasting every development. The prosecution's case was built methodically, brick by brick, much like the dam itself, but with integrity as its foundation. The emotional core of the trial was the testimony of Silas Miller. On the stand, the frail, elderly man spoke with a quiet dignity, his voice trembling, but clear. He recounted the final days of Havenwood, the palpable fear, and the sight of Richard Sinclair fleeing the library, his face scratched and his eyes wild with panic. For the first time in 40 years, Silas spoke his truth without fear, his words a powerful, human counterpoint to the cold, technical evidence, giving the jury a direct, emotional connection to the crime's final, terrifying moments. Matt Hayes found himself thrust into the uncomfortable glare of the spotlight as the prosecution's key witness. He calmly and methodically walked the jury through his journey from the moment he saw the resurrected town on the news to the chilling discovery of Elena's final words. On cross-examination, Sinclair's defense team was merciless. They attacked his motives, portraying him as an unstable opportunist seeking to capitalize on a family tragedy. They questioned his architectural expertise, his relationship with the media, and his emotional state. But Matt held his ground, his answers firm and unwavering. He was not there for fame or fortune. He was there to give a voice to the woman who had been silenced, to be the guardian of her legacy. He looked directly at the jury, his conviction clear. "I am here," he stated, "because the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, has a right to be heard." The most powerful testimony, however, came from beyond the grave. Dr. Evelyn Reed took the stand, not as a storyteller, but as a scientist, explaining the meticulous process of restoring the documents. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as the prosecutor projected high-resolution images of Elena's journal onto a large screen and read her final entry aloud. Her steady, determined script filled the room, her words an intimate and damning indictment of the man sitting impassively at the defense table. Then, the annotated blueprints were presented, each of Elena's red-pen notes a precise, factual accusation of fraud and endangerment. In that moment, Elena Caldwell was no longer a victim or a ghost. She was the chief witness for her own prosecution, her integrity and intellect reaching across 4 decades to dismantle Sinclair's empire of lies with the undeniable power of the documented truth. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged schoolteacher, refused to look at the defense table. The verdict was read with a solemn finality that seemed to suck the air from the room. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Sinclair, guilty. A collective gasp, a mixture of shock and relief, swept through the gallery. The foreman continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. Guilty of fraud, guilty of conspiracy, guilty on all counts. Sinclair, for the first time, seemed to shrink. The mask of arrogant defiance finally cracked, revealing the hollowed-out shell of a man who had outrun his past for a lifetime, only to be caught in the final stretch. Justice, delayed for 40 years, had finally arrived, delivered not with a bang but with the quiet, devastating weight of a single word: guilty. Richard Sinclair was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that, given his advanced age, was a death sentence. He was transferred to a secure medical penitentiary, his palatial estate traded for a sterile room and the constant hum of life support machines. He died there just 11 months later from complications of a stroke, a silent, ignominious end for a man who had built an empire on noise and intimidation. His company, Sinclair Construction, collapsed under the weight of dozens of state and federal lawsuits, its assets liquidated to help fund the decommissioning of the dam and to compensate the families who had been forced to evacuate their homes. His name, once a symbol of progress and power, became a byword for corporate malfeasance, a cautionary tale taught in business ethics courses across the country. His legacy was erased, just as he had tried to erase Elena's. Months after the trial, Matt returned to the Havenwood Valley. The reservoir was nearly empty, a vast, muddy basin where a town was slowly re-emerging, its wounds exposed to the sun. He walked the old Main Street, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the skeletal remains of buildings. He found the stone foundation of the library, all that was left of Elena's fortress. He stood there for a long time, a sense of profound, quiet closure washing over him. He had not just cleared a family name, he had restored a truth. He had fulfilled a duty to a woman he had never met, but now knew better than anyone. He realized his entire life had been about building structures, but this, the reconstruction of a legacy, was the most important project he would ever complete. The Havenwood Dam scandal sent shockwaves through the engineering and political landscapes of the nation. It triggered a massive, federally mandated review of all dams built during the same period, uncovering similar, though less severe, instances of corner-cutting and falsified reports in a dozen other states. The Havenwood precedent became a legal and ethical benchmark, leading to stricter oversight regulations and whistleblower protection laws for infrastructure projects. Elena Caldwell's meticulous, lonely work in the final days of her life had a ripple effect that extended far beyond her small valley. Her sacrifice, intended to save her own community, ended up protecting countless others. Her legacy transformed from a local tragedy into a national safeguard. The truth she died for had, in the end, proven to be a foundation for a safer future for millions. The public narrative surrounding Havenwood was permanently rewritten. The town was no longer remembered as a quaint casualty of progress, and Elena Caldwell was no longer the, quote, crazy, great aunt from family lore. She was celebrated as a hero, a woman of extraordinary courage and foresight. The state, as part of its settlement, funded the creation of the Havenwood Memorial Park. The library's stone foundation was preserved, and a bronze plaque was installed, telling the story of the librarian who chose to stand against a corrupt system, armed with nothing but the truth. Her story became a symbol of civic duty and intellectual integrity, a powerful reminder that one person's refusal to be silenced can, in fact, change the world. Her name, once a source of shame for Matt's family, was now a source of immense pride. Before leaving the valley for the last time, Matt paid a visit to Silas Miller. He found the old man sitting on his porch, looking out at the distant, now tamed river. The deep-seated fear that had shadowed Silas's eyes for 40 years was gone, replaced by a serene, quiet peace. "She would be proud of you, son," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave her back her voice. You let us all remember her the right way." They sat in comfortable silence. Two men from different generations, connected by the memory of one extraordinary woman. For Silas, the final chapter of his life could now be lived without the weight of the secret he had carried. He could finally remember Havenwood not for its violent end, but for the vibrant life it held, and for the unwavering courage of his friend, Elena. Matt stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the emerging landscape. He held a sketchbook, but he wasn't designing a skyscraper. He was sketching a small, elegant memorial pavilion to be built around the library's foundation, a place for quiet reflection. He had learned that the most enduring structures are not built from steel and concrete, which can crack and fail, but from truth and memory, which, if properly guarded, can last forever. The water had once concealed a terrible crime, a dark secret held under immense pressure. But in receding, it had revealed something far more powerful, a legacy of courage that had refused to be drowned, a truth that had finally, after 40 years, found its way back to the light. In the end, the water receded completely, leaving the valley floor exposed under the Tennessee sun for the first time in a generation. The land, scarred and muddy, began the slow, arduous process of healing. Wild grasses started to push through the cracked earth, and the Ocoee River, now freed from the failing dam, carved its original, gentler path through the landscape. Matt Hayes often returned to this place of rebirth, standing on the stone foundation of the library that had once been his great-aunt's fortress. He had come here seeking answers about a forgotten past, a quest to understand a shadow on his family's name. He left with a profound understanding that the strongest structures are not built of concrete and steel, but of truth and memory, foundations that, once restored, can withstand the pressures of any flood, real or metaphorical. Helena Caldwell's legacy rippled far beyond the quiet valley where she made her last stand. The Havenwood precedent became a landmark case, forcing a nationwide reassessment of critical infrastructure projects and the corporate powers behind them. Her meticulously documented evidence, preserved by a simple leather pouch and a steel box, became the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless lives in the decades to come. She was no longer a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. She became a national symbol of integrity, a testament to the fact that a single, determined voice, armed with irrefutable facts, could dismantle an empire and hold the powerful to account. Her lonely fight in the dying light of her library had, in the end, illuminated a path toward a safer, more transparent future for millions who would never even know her name. The town of Havenwood itself was reborn, not as a collection of homes, but as a place of solemn remembrance and education. The Havenwood Memorial Park was established, preserving the ghostly outlines of the old town streets and the foundations of its most significant buildings. At the heart of it all, on the spot where Elena's library once stood, a simple bronze plaque was set in stone. It did not speak of a madwoman who chose to drown with her books. Instead, it told the story of a guardian, a scholar, and a hero, who gave her life to protect a truth she knew the world would one day need to hear. Visitors now walk the quiet paths, reading her story, learning that progress without integrity is a hollow victory, and that the soul of a community can, in fact, outlast the concrete and steel meant to erase it. The rusted safe, the catalyst for this entire journey, was eventually placed in the State Museum, displayed in a climate-controlled case. It sat there, a humble, oxidized steel box, a stark contrast to the gleaming artifacts surrounding it. It was a potent symbol, a reminder that the most valuable things are often not what is protected, but the act of protection itself. It represented Elena's unwavering faith that the truth, if properly shielded, could endure any pressure, any depth, any length of time. It had been her ark, a vessel she had sent into a 40-year flood, trusting that one day the waters would recede and her message would be found. Its silent, corroded form spoke louder than any monument, a testament to the enduring power of a single, defiant act of preservation against the forces of erasure. For Matt Hayes, the journey transformed him in ways he never could have anticipated. He had started his investigation to quiet a ghost in his family's past, but in the process, he had found the true foundation of his own identity. He continued his work as an architect, but his designs were now infused with a deeper sense of purpose and responsibility. He understood that every structure carries a story, and that integrity is not just an engineering principle, but a moral imperative. He had set out to solve a 40-year-old mystery, but he had ended up rebuilding a legacy. His great-aunt Elena, the woman he had never met, had become his greatest teacher, showing him that the most important thing a person can build is not a skyscraper that touches the clouds, but a truth that can stand the test of time. Richard Sinclair's empire, once a towering monument to ambition and ruthless efficiency, crumbled into dust. His name, once synonymous with power and progress, became a permanent stain on the state's history. His quiet death in a prison medical ward was a footnote, a pathetic and lonely end for a man who had commanded so much influence. His story served as a stark lesson that fortunes built on lies have foundations of sand, and that no amount of wealth or power can permanently entomb a crime. The valley he had drowned to launch his career ultimately became his undoing. He had tried to bury his sin under a lake, but he had only succeeded in preserving it, creating a perfect time capsule of his own guilt that waited patiently for the inevitable drought to bring it all to light. In her final terrifying moments, Elena Caldwell must have felt utterly alone, a solitary guardian of a truth the world seemed determined to ignore. Yet her final act was not one of despair, but of profound hope. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that the facts she had gathered were more powerful than the water that would soon consume her, more enduring than the man who sought to silence her. She entrusted her legacy to a steel box and the random chance of future discovery, a final, desperate message in a bottle cast into a man-made sea. Her story is a powerful reminder that history is not just written by the victors, it is also preserved by the vigilant, the principled, and the brave, who believe that no truth is ever truly lost as long as one person is willing to die to protect it. The story of Havenwood forces us to look beneath the surface of our own world, to question the foundations of the progress we often take for granted. How many other truths lie submerged, waiting for a catalyst for a curious descendant, or for an unexpected drought to bring them into the light? Elena's fight was a singular epic of courage, but the forces she stood against, corporate greed, corruption, and the silencing of dissent, are universal and timeless. Her story is a map, a guide for those who might find their own rusted safes, their own inherited mysteries. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger, a reminder that the past is never truly past, and its secrets are always waiting for a voice. For 40 years the water kept its silence, a vast, liquid shroud over a town and its secrets. But in the end, it was not the water that held the ultimate power. It was the truth. The story of Havenwood teaches us that truth, like water, is a relentless force of nature. You can dam it up, you can bury it deep, you can try to contain it under immense pressure, but it will always seek its own level. It will find the smallest crack, the slightest weakness, and it will push through with an inexorable force until it breaks free. The water concealed a crime, but it was the truth that ultimately washed it all away, leaving behind a clean, indelible legacy of a woman who knew that some things are worth fighting for, and that no secret can be kept forever.